this episode, we move from selecting controls and planning continued compliance to a step that determines whether any of it will actually work in real life. Allocating controls across owners and securing stakeholder agreement without gaps. Controls do not operate by themselves, and frameworks do not accept a plan that only exists in a document if no one is clearly accountable for making it real. Allocation means deciding who owns each control, who performs the day-to-day activities that keep it working, who provides evidence, and who is responsible when something fails. Stakeholder agreement means that the people and teams who must carry these responsibilities actually understand them and accept them, rather than being surprised later during an assessment or an incident. The dangerous part is that gaps are often created quietly, not by bad intent, but by assumptions, unclear boundaries, and shared responsibility language that sounds cooperative while hiding the fact that no one is truly assigned. The goal here is to give you a way to allocate controls that is clear, defensible, and sustainable, and to secure agreement in a way that reduces conflict and prevents last-minute scrambling. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at CGRC.Me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good way to start is to recognize that control ownership is not the same as system ownership, and this is where many beginners get tripped up. A system owner might be accountable for overall compliance, but that owner rarely controls every layer of the environment, especially in shared services and common platforms. Identity services might be owned by an enterprise team, network boundaries might be owned by infrastructure, security monitoring might be owned by a security operations group, and cloud hosting protections might be owned by a platform team. Your system might also depend on third parties, which introduces contract and vendor stakeholders. Control allocation is the process of mapping each control requirement to the right operational owner based on who can actually implement and maintain it. This mapping must reflect reality, not organizational charts that look neat on paper. A defensible allocation shows that every control has an owner who has the authority and capability to carry it out. To allocate controls without gaps, you need a consistent way to describe responsibilities that goes beyond naming a team. A practical approach is to think in roles such as accountable, responsible, consulted, and informed, even if you never use those exact labels in the final document. Accountable is the party who is on the hook if the control fails. Responsible is the party who does the work. Consulted is the party whose input is needed for correct implementation. And informed is the party who needs to know status. Many controls have at least two parties involved, such as a shared service operator and a system team that integrates and uses the service. If you only name one owner, you can accidentally hide the integration responsibilities that make the control effective. If you name multiple owners without distinguishing responsibilities, you can create confusion and delay because everyone assumes someone else is taking the lead. Clear allocation describes what each party does in operational terms, such as approving access requests, maintaining configuration baselines, reviewing logs, or tracking remediation. That level of detail is what prevents gaps. Inherited controls create a special challenge because the system benefits from a control that is operated elsewhere, but the system still has accountability for its own compliance posture. If a shared identity provider enforces authentication, the identity team may be responsible for operating that service, but your system team may be responsible for using it correctly, such as ensuring all users go through it and that local bypass accounts are not created. If a centralized logging service stores logs, the shared team may be responsible for retention and protection, but your team may be responsible for sending the right events and responding to alerts relevant to the system. Allocation should make those shared responsibilities explicit, including who produces which evidence. Otherwise, you end up with a situation where the shared team says we provide the platform, and the system team says we assumed the platform team handled it, and the assessor sees a control with no proof. Allocation is the place where you prevent that by turning assumptions into explicit assignments. Another source of gaps is controls that are process-heavy rather than technology-heavy, like access reviews, training, incident response coordination, and change management. These controls often span multiple teams, And if you do not allocate them carefully, they become everyone's job, which means no one's job. For example, access review might require the system owner to review role assignments, the identity team to provide the access list, and managers to confirm which staff still need access. If any one of those steps is missing, the review becomes a ritual without substance. Similarly, incident response might require security operations to detect and triage, system engineers to investigate and remediate, communications teams to coordinate messaging, and risk owners to make decisions about containment versus availability. Allocation should describe these handoffs clearly, because in an incident, there is no time to negotiate roles. In compliance, assessors often look for evidence that these roles are defined in advance, because that is a sign the organization is prepared rather than improvising. Securing stakeholder agreement is not just sending a document and hoping people read it, because real agreement requires shared understanding. A practical method is to present control allocations in terms of what each stakeholder is expected to do, how often they must do it, and what evidence they must produce. Stakeholders need to hear what changes in their workload and what is expected in routine operations, not just in audit season. They also need to understand why the control matters in terms of system impact and mission risk, because people are more willing to accept responsibility when they understand the consequences of failure. Agreement is stronger when you show that you have considered feasibility, such as whether the team has staffing and access needed to perform reviews or respond to alerts. If you assign a control to a team that lacks the necessary permissions or tools, the assignment is not agreement. It is a future failure. A mature approach surfaces those capability questions early and resolves them before the control set is finalized. Another helpful strategy is to treat control allocation as a negotiation of interfaces between teams rather than as a demand that one team does everything. An interface is a clear statement of what one team provides to another, such as the identity team providing group membership reports, the security operations team providing alert routing and escalation procedures, or the platform team providing baseline hardening and patching evidence. When interfaces are defined, teams can plan their work and expectations become predictable. Without interfaces, teams get pulled into last-minute requests for evidence and ad hoc changes, which creates resentment and reduces trust. Defensible compliance depends on predictable processes, and predictable processes depend on clear interfaces. When you design allocation around interfaces, you also make it easier to onboard new systems because the shared services operate the same way each time. Gaps also hide in the difference between owning a control and owning a control's outcomes. A team might say they operate a vulnerability scanning service, but that does not mean vulnerabilities are remediated. Another team might say they handle patching, but that does not mean the system owner has verified that patching covers all components and environments. Allocation should reflect the full life cycle of a control, including detection, decision, action, and verification. For vulnerability management, that might mean one team runs scans, another triages, system engineers remediate, and governance tracks exceptions and deadlines. If you allocate only the first step, you create a gap that will show up as unresolved findings. For access control, one team might enforce authentication, another defines roles, another approves access, and someone must periodically verify the model still matches reality. The control works only when the steps form a closed loop. Allocation is how you close the loop on paper so it can be closed in practice. To secure agreement without gaps, you also need a simple way to resolve disputes when two stakeholders disagree about ownership. Disputes often come down to authority and capability. So a fair rule is to assign responsibility to the party that can actually implement the control and assign accountability to the party that owns the risk for the system. Then define dependencies clearly, so the responsible party has what it needs. If an enterprise team insists they own a common control, confirm that the system is in scope of that control and that evidence will be available. If a system team is asked to own a control that depends on a shared service, ensure the shared service team commits to providing the necessary capability and evidence. If a third party is involved, ensure contracts and service agreements support the control expectations. The point is to avoid unresolved ambiguity, because ambiguity becomes gaps under stress. In compliance, it is better to have a slightly awkward conversation early than a failed assessment later. A continued compliance strategy also depends on allocation because monitoring and vulnerability management require ongoing action, not one-time implementation. If alerts are generated, someone must be assigned to respond, and that response must be documented. If vulnerabilities are discovered, someone must be assigned to remediate or formally accept risk, and deadlines must be tracked. If access reviews are scheduled, someone must conduct them and ensure results lead to changes. If backups are tested, someone must run the test and record outcomes. These activities are often distributed across teams, and if allocation is unclear, they either do not happen or they happen inconsistently. The result is not only a compliance issue, but an operational risk issue, because missing these activities increases the chance of incidents and slow recovery. Allocation ties your strategy to real people and real processes, which is why it is so critical. By the end of this lesson, the main outcome is that you can allocate controls across owners in a way that is precise enough to prevent gaps and realistic enough to be accepted by stakeholders. You understand that control ownership often spans shared services, system teams, security operations, and governance functions, and you can define responsibilities in operational terms rather than vague shared responsibility language. You know how to handle inherited controls by clarifying what the common control provider delivers and what the system team must do to remain in scope, and you know how to secure agreement by aligning responsibilities with authority and capability. You also recognize that allocation must cover the full life cycle of control operation, including evidence production, so that continued compliance is sustainable. When controls are allocated clearly and stakeholders truly agree, compliance becomes less of an annual event and more of a steady, coordinated practice where everyone knows their part and gaps have far fewer places to hide.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.